very encouraging.
I think today is going to be a really fascinating conversation. I joke that Matt Donahue is SDOT's bridge whisperer, but we're also going to have the excellent privilege and opportunity to be joined by Greg Banks of WSP, who is the bridge wonkiness translator. Which is also an extremely helpful and important skill set to all of us. But with that, and without much further ado, just a reminder, we're all getting so good at using these digital platforms, but please make sure that you are muted. For those of us who are able to use headphones when able, I've also found that especially on the WebEx platform, it just makes for a much clearer sound. It really picks up the echo and not coming through on headphones. And then today, I'm going to really try and be intentional about having us use the chat to acknowledge when we have questions, but then I'm going to call on our task force members to come off of mute and then verbalize their questions. So that everyone can hear them, and for folks where reading is easier, it's also in the chat box. But again, everybody can hear and or read. So standard practice using the chat function to mark a note when you have a question. When there's an appropriate moment, I'll interject in the presentation and acknowledge that there is a question, and I will either read it on your behalf if you're having trouble coming off of mute, or ask the task force member to ask the question themselves. And that way we can all follow along and be up to speed. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our co-chair, Mayor Nichols, to get us going. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Michael. Now, my main task was to introduce Greg Banks, who Michael just did. So I will be very brief. Our agenda today, as you have seen, includes an update on the bridge and the repairs. We're going to revisit the low bridge access policy and ask some questions of you in terms of moving forward on that. We'll get another update on Reconnect West Seattle, but most of our time will be spent on the cost-benefit analysis with Greg Banks and Alex Prentice from the city's consulting engineering firm to talk about where we are in that process, what we know, and what more we will know by October, so that we can make a recommendation to the mayor. We normally have, the last couple of meetings we've had breakout sessions. Paulina and I felt that given the importance of this cost-benefit analysis and the depth of that information, that it would be better if we kept together and had that conversation as one group and heard the update as one group. So that's why we're pursuing it in this fashion. One other note, Marcy Carpenter, I don't know if Marcy's with us right now, but Marcy has expressed some frustration with accessing the materials in our meetings. She is the president of the National Federation of the Blind of Washington. She's been a member of this task force and has contributed, but this particular format that we are using, this platform that we're using, has been a frustration for her. Marcy, I want you to know we're working on that. We had a conversation with staff about that. I know that Paulina has responded to your emails, and we will continue to work on that till we find an answer that allows you to fully participate in a manner that is comfortable for you and makes you fully able to participate in our meetings and outside of our meetings. So with that, Paulina, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Greg. I just wanted to welcome everyone and thank you for your participation today. Thank you also for all the feedback, reflection forms that you send us, always helping us to do better. This is a very important subject for all of us who are sitting on this task force, so I really appreciate the time that you take to be fully present in our meetings, but also to continue sending us reflection, feedback, to make these accessible for everyone and to make sure everyone can participate. So I also wanted to acknowledge that we are living in difficult times. I'm sending lots of thoughts for those of you who are parents. School started and it's not an easy week. So I wanted to acknowledge that too, that we go day by day environmentally. Some communities are also being harmed. Many of Washington State, Oregon, by the wildfires, bringing air pollution to communities that are already impacted. And I wanted to also acknowledge that, and that we all, as we are learning to work together, we acknowledge all these things that are important. So I think we're all ready to get started. We're going to start with Heather Marks, who is going to be giving us some bridge updates. And today we're not going to have, I know that many of you have told us how much you enjoy those groups, because as Greg said, the subgroup, we have a full pack agenda. We needed to all be present, and then we promised for the next one we will start with the subgroups, which are always very enriching. And yes, a reminder, if when we are talking, to please say the names of ourselves asking the questions, and for people to make sure that they understand who's talking, for those who need some accessibility. So thank you and welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much, Paulina and Greg. I'm Heather Marks. I am the program director for the West Seattle Bridge Safety Program. And today I want to talk to you about a number of things. The first is the bridge stabilization work and where we are there. And then I also want to discuss the bridge program funding legislation. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So I hope everybody can see these pictures because they're kind of cool. The first one is a picture of underneath the high bridge where those work platforms are busy moving back and forth to support the exterior work that's happening on the bridge. We installed those in July, and now they are moving to Area 3. And the second picture, it just looks like grayness, but if you look carefully, you can see that there are small syringes that are placed in the affected areas, and they're used to channel epoxy into those cracks. I want to make sure that we're all really clear that the epoxy isn't a repair technique. It's not something that's going to make the bridge stronger, but it does protect the steel that's inside the concrete. So that's why we do that. Next slide, please. So the first picture here is, if you see the gray structures sort of toward the front of the picture, those are the post-tensioning brackets that we're going to attach to the inside of the bridge that will help pull the concrete of that center span together. Those have been specially fabricated, each and every one, and they weigh about 2,500 pounds a piece. They have a little gantry in there that helps move them because they're so heavy. And then there's another picture of the crack injection, as well as the carbon fiber wrap in a section where many of the larger cracks have been identified. And that carbon fiber reinforced polymer is going to help hold those chunks in place and support the work that the additional post-tensioning is doing. So that is all happening right now. Next slide, please. Incidentally, I think someone asked me how often they work, and they're on the job 6 days a week. So, you know, we're given 1 day to take some time off, but the crews are working on all of that 6 days a week. So the next thing I want to talk about, if we're ready to move on, is the low bridge access policy. Now, if you are like me, and maybe you are, you feel like we talk about the low bridge access policy a lot. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that the low bridge has gained outsized importance in our system. And the second is a lot of people want or need to use the low bridge in order to do their daily work. So next slide, please. So while there are lots of people who feel really strongly about low bridge, there are also folks on this panel who maybe are not as engaged with that. And so we, in the world that we're in, where we're going to have to make a number of adjustments going forward to manage that low bridge access, including automated enforcement, which is coming up really quickly. ILWU workers that aren't going to need regular access now because the Matson operation has moved down to Tacoma for the time being. Van pool requests are increasing. Employer shuttle proposals are under development, though they are not using the low bridge right now. And prior to enforcement, we have a recommendation to allow all the essential van pools without placards. And so we would like to take a phased approach to automated enforcement where we continue to rely on human police to supplement the automated enforcement. We also want to see if we can form a subcommittee of this task force to inform those allocation policies with representatives from business, employers, maritime and industrial, labor, with staff from the city, metro, and port. That would be an open subcommittee. Anybody who's interested could serve. And so if the task force agrees that a subcommittee is a good place to handle those low bridge access policy questions, you can let us know if you of your interest at that link there. Are there any questions?
I just have a little comment on that. I think the idea of a subcommittee would be fine. I'd like to not volunteer for it, but ask that it look at the ILWU issue, that they are dispatched from one location and they are going to one location. So I don't think that the system that we have, where each individual worker gets a placard and access in a single occupant vehicle, makes much sense. I think that we should ask the employer and the union to work with us to figure out a van pool system that would work for them, thus, not taking up that much capacity of the very limited capacity that we have. So, we're trying to balance a lot of different needs. The West Seattle businesses, I know, are suffering, and they, I think, are making a strong case for why they need additional access. I think in this case, it might be one where we could balance that a little more finely than we have to date. So I hope folks, particularly maritime concerns, West Seattle business concerns, will step up and try and work this through this committee. So thanks, Heather.
Heather, can
Thank
I jump in a moment and respond to those remarks, if I may?
Sure.
And just so whoever's running the tech part, for whatever reason, I can't post in the chat. Maybe it's operator error, but I just thought I'd bring that up. So in relation to ILWU access, I know this comes up just about every meeting, and I've been in conversations with the West Seattle Chamber, and I believe we're on the same page about making sure that everybody's needs are met in relation to when our dispatched workforce needs the bridge in certain hours of the day, and when businesses in West Seattle absolutely need the bridge in those off hours to get supplies for their operations. So we're in conversations directly with the West Seattle Chamber, and we're, and if any of those folks are on here, feel free to add in, but it's my impression that we really want to focus on what that looks like on the automated side, like the placards. That's that ship has sort of sailed, and by the time we solve that problem, that'll probably be gone anyway. And so we're really looking toward like what the automated system looks like for the long term. And I'm happy to entertain that discussion with anybody, and make sure we can make whatever accommodations we can. So appreciate your remarks, Mr. Mayor.
And that was John Persak. Just a reminder to please say your name when you're speaking.
Okay,
Councilmember Herbold, I think, is asking to be recognized. Councilmember.
Thank you so much. This is Lisa Herbold. As it relates specifically to the proposal for a task force, can you help me understand a little bit more about the scope of the task force as envisioned? Is it specifically limited to the allocation policies, or is it will we ask this task force to opine on more broadly on the low bridge access policy? Because we've heard that when automated enforcement begins, that this will be another opportunity to more broadly look at the policy.
Well, I think that the idea is that what you're talking about is part of the low bridge access policy. Any of those questions about who and how and when folks can access the low bridge to use it. What we're envisioning as staff is that this group would sit at the table with staff as we try to determine how things will change when automated enforcement takes place, how things will change now that ILWU has a slightly less intense need to use the low bridge, and then what will happen when ILWU comes back because Terminal 5, because Matson returns. So I think it's the full range of low bridge access.
Thank you.
Let me just, there's a question in the chat. What it isn't is to talk about anything that's around the low bridge.
Understood.
So for example, West Marginal Way is not within the purview of the low bridge access.
And so I just want to confirm that so it's broader than just placard allocation policies.
Right.
But it's not so broad to incorporate things outside of the low bridge. And you call out interest in having representatives from business, employers, maritime, industrial, and labor to serve on the task force, but it is not limited to those. I just want to make sure that if this is a broader policy than just placard allocation, that, for instance, residents who live in the Northern Peninsula can feel free to participate.
So, right, the membership will be limited to people who are serving on the community task force.
Right.
But anybody who's on the community task force that's interested in serving on this subcommittee is more than welcome. We would definitely not turn anyone away.
Thank you.
Dan, I think Dan wanted to be recognized.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, I think John and I are on the same page here for the business community versus maritime and ILWU. So I think we should be able to work together. The part that we're going to really need is the technical capabilities of that lower bridge enforcement technology, so that we can figure out exactly what we can do. I know that this being a much more dynamic system, I think there should be a lot more access to being able to be opened up. So we'll work with that, and we appreciate working with John and the ILWU and SDOT on this. It is quite a struggle right now for us businesses, so we appreciate it.
Yeah. The subcommittee would have support from SDOT staff, OED staff, and of course we'd like the Port of Seattle and King County Metro to participate as well on the staff level.
Just quick, I want to make sure we read. Deb Barker had a question. Just fully read it out loud so everybody can hear it. And Deb's question was about the low bridge subcommittee. Could they be involved in the West Marginal Way Southwest project number FO6 topic, and FO6
No.
has to do with West Marginal Way, northbound lane.
Right.
But just so everybody is aware of what the full question was.
Right. So no, this subcommittee would be specifically directed to the Low Bridge access policy, not anything around the Low Bridge.
And then just one last thing, thanking Councilmember Herbold for her good digital hand-raising etiquette, and raising her hand and then lowering it so we can keep track of who has a real-time question. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we've already covered these, but we are looking for folks from West Seattle business, from the maritime and industrial community, labor, schools, employer shuttles. But we're not limited. So whoever would like to participate in the conversation fruitfully is most welcome. Staff would be available to help. We're not looking for a giant group, so maybe 4 to 5 people to represent those stakeholder perspectives, but that's not cast in stone. So it would be great if you could indicate your interest in this week's reflection form. There is a link to that in the chat. Yes, Laura Radford has asked, will this task force include discussions around the automated system? Laura Radford, that would be part of the conversation for sure. Okay, are we ready to move on? All right, let's do it. So our next, oh, sorry, I think that's you, Greg. So the next conversation will be Reconnect West Seattle, and I'd like to welcome Colin Drake and Danielle Friedman to lead that presentation.
Thanks, Heather. This is Colin Drake, SDOT. As you all know, Reconnect West Seattle is a plan to allow similar levels of travel across the Duwamish to what we saw before the closure of the high-rise bridge. This will have modal shifts because there is not capacity across the Duwamish for single occupant vehicle travel, similar to what we had before the closure. We need to reduce the impact of environmental injustice in the Duwamish Valley, both historical injustice and also the additional injustice of the additional traffic that these communities are experiencing. Next slide. All right, so today we are going to release the Reconnect West Seattle final implementation plan. And I want to be clear that this is a summary of what we received during July, public feedback on projects that were on the neighborhood and on the Mobility Action Plan surveys. This implementation plan does not cover all of the activity that's happening in West Seattle. For instance, there is an ongoing discussion about a permanent signal at Highland and Holden in Highland Park, and that is not covered in the implementation plan. As we just discussed, there's many considerations related to low bridge policy, and that is not covered in the implementation plan. These are obviously very important topics that we will continue to cover, but I just wanted to make sure that it's clear what is in the implementation plan, survey results and our actions and response, and what is not. These other things that are related, but not specifically part of the survey. So SDOT plans an initial investment of $6 million. And why 6? Because we know that there will be a need to balance funding among neighborhoods, freight, and bikes, but there are so many unknowns between now and when we get to that final funding allocation. And so as a result, we're starting off with a commitment to spend $1 million on each. So $1 million for each neighborhood, $1 million for bikes, $1 million for freight, with the understanding that that is not the end of the conversation, that some of those categories will get considerably more funding and some will get somewhat more funding, but we need to know a lot more about the costs of these projects, about the other projects that are not in the survey but are related, and then also racial and social equity, the population of each of these areas, the travel demand and the traffic that are in these areas, and then many other considerations. So the bridge is not, to my knowledge, getting fixed soon. And so we will have some time to sort out how we are going to allocate the funds that we are spending to mitigate the effects of the bridge closure. In 2020, and this is all in the implementation plan, and we'll go through it at a very high level here, but I'm also happy to answer specific questions. But in 2020, we've identified 23 projects or actions, and that includes bikes, freight, and neighborhoods, in addition to mobility action plan elements. And then as we move into this fall and into next year, there's 32 additional projects and programs that move into project development. And I understand that that is a jargony term, and I apologize. What that means, what project development means, is to say, you know what, as opposed to these 23 projects that we're just going to go build here in 2020, these additional 32 projects, there needs to be some more definition. We need to know, okay, say it's an intersection improvement. All right, so what specifically is that intersection improvement? Does there need to be some analysis for that intersection improvement? Do we need to come back to the community and say, hey, here is what would happen if we make this change that was requested? Is that what you really want? Or, as we'll talk about here in a minute, it's something like traffic calming or our home zone program that includes many elements. And so this project development phase that these projects are moving into, it helps provide the definition. It helps get the confirmation from the community that we're doing the intended thing. There's others that, for instance, modifications to facilities that WashDOT has jurisdiction over. So project development also means SDOT is going to work with our partners like WashDOT to move it forward, get the necessary approvals, do the analysis, and move forward into implementation in 2021. And we understand that 2021 does that mean, March 21 or December 21? And that's a very valid question. As we go forward with Reconnect West Seattle, we will provide that kind of definition and that detail about when this outreach is going to happen with the community to confirm the definition of the project, when we're actually going to implement it in 2021. We just don't know that today, and we want to get this plan out today. So we understand that that information needs to come. It's just not going to be in today's document. As I mentioned, this list is not exhaustive. The purpose of the Reconnect West Seattle surveys was to get feedback from the community on what SDOT should do first. What should we do right now in 2020 while we have a limited construction season remaining before the rain starts? So we heard that. We know what we're going to proceed with in 2020, and we know what comes next and where we need further community engagement. As I mentioned, the home zone program is a way to deliver safety and speed reduction efforts. And so these are in the communities that have said, we have a lot of cut through traffic. There is speeding on our residential streets. We need some pedestrian safety improvements. This home zone program is a way to do that comprehensively. It's not going to be one thing. It's going to be a package of things. And that's why coming in September, October, and throughout the rainy season, we're going to work with the communities to define exactly what that is and get it ready to roll in 2021. So we, through the Mobility Action Plan survey, we heard from the community that there is some willingness to change travel behavior. So we're optimistic that, it might not be all the specific modes that were envisioned initially going into the process. It might not be that for instance, waterborne transit does as heavy a lift. It might be that traditional rubber tire transit is able to carry more people. And again, this is all post-COVID, which I can't be dismissive of a pandemic, but let's all be hopeful that we do look at a world after the pandemic where mass transit again becomes an option to move a lot of people. So I think stay tuned for more from us on Reconnect West Seattle, and I will hand it over to Danielle for some of the community feedback we received.
And very quickly, Colin, thank you so much. And Danielle, before you get started, there are two questions, and I'll read them both out loud, and then Colin, if you could take those before pass on to Danielle. Deb Barker asked, will you be talking about how completion of the project timelines are to be shared with the community? That's the first question. And then from our co-chair, Mary Nichols, the 32 projects in 21, are these limited to survey as well?
Thanks, Michael. So yes, Deb, we today are not going to be sharing information about these timelines for the things that we don't have enough detail on yet. I think that so here's two ways we could share this information. One is we are doing quarterly updates to this implementation plan. But I think far before, I guess a quarter would be December-ish for the next iteration of the plan, we need to come out and say, here's what we have learned from September 9th. So, 2 weeks from now or the next task force meeting and the one after that, I think we can continue to provide information on, for instance, the home zone program. That's one that's ramping up now. We'll be able to say, all right, South Park, Georgetown, and the West Seattle communities, here is when we can have that discussion about home zones. Here's where we can engage you on that topic. And then once we're able to do that outreach, we'll have a better understanding about what implementation will look like in 2021. So totally valid question. We need to give you those timelines. We don't have that information today, and we will be giving it to you as we go forward. And Mayor Nichols, yes, everything, the 23 projects for 2020, the 32 projects for 2021, all of those were generated by the surveys, both the neighborhood surveys and the mobility action plan surveys.
Thank you. I guess the frustration that I have is those were by definition smaller projects, projects that could be implemented really quickly or relatively quickly. But the mitigation for this is going to take bigger projects that are going to take a bit longer as well, particularly if we go immediately to replacement. And so I guess what I'm looking for is after we get through this initial conversation around replacement versus repair and then replacement, I'd like to see a mitigation plan that includes the larger things that have been suggested and what follow-up has been done on those. I know that the Highland Park and Holden issue is a big one for me. Highland Park and West Marginal is a big one. And there have been suggestions of crossings, different crossings of the Duwamish temporarily. So let's think about a month from now or 6 weeks from now at our meeting, having a mitigation plan that addresses the larger pieces as well as the ones that we've gone through this community process with. Thank you.
Great. Okay, and so I think that was similar to Colleen's question about, okay, yeah. Yes, great. Thank you all, Mayor Nichols and Colleen, for bringing that request to our attention. And I think we absolutely should, I think as we move forward with Reconnect West Seattle, we'll continue to talk about, okay, here was the results of the public survey process. Here are projects that are, above and beyond that are more expensive and are nonetheless crucial, and we are proceeding with, and we'll be able to give information on that. Okay?
Thank you.
Danielle?
Okay, hi all, I'm Danielle Friedman. I work for the Department of Neighborhoods, and I'm working on the outreach and engagement piece with SDOT on this project. So I just wanted to delve in a little bit into the community feedback and responses that we heard. Again, there's a lot more specifics in the implementation plan, but I just wanted to rise up some of the overall themes that we heard across the neighborhoods through the neighborhood prioritization process. One thing we heard was the traffic calming is a major priority, and those weren't always reflected in the ballots. And so we recognize this, and that is SDOT's response is expanding the home zone programs to South Park, Georgetown, Rocks Hill, Highland Park, Riverview, and South Delridge. Colin mentioned this, but it's a holistic approach to encouraging slower vehicle speeds. And they can include things like traffic circles, speed humps, access management, cost-effective walkways, coupled with neighborhood activation and beautification. So those should get at some of those traffic calming priorities. Another thing that we heard through the ballots and through the community check-ins and meetings that we've been having with community, the priorities that came to the top did reflect the community need, but community members would like to see additional ideas and solutions implemented quickly, which is kind of what we just touched on. The projects for 2020 implementation, they're well defined, requiring little additional designer input, so they're able to move fast on them. SDOT crew capacity limits due to COVID-19 social distancing requirements and other factors is a key determinant in project implementation. Also, like Colin mentioned, the rainy season is coming, and so there's some time restrictions on that, but we will definitely be working towards additional ideas and solutions that can happen even outside of those selected priorities. And then another thing that we wanted to just surface is that we did hear that there was disappointment that the ballots included detour-related projects that were already moving toward completion. And that took votes away from other needed projects. But we really just want to highlight that these priorities were the initial things that could get done quickly and that were the most important to prioritize. And again, SDOT and DON are reviewing ideas that came up outside the ballot selections, and we're going to continue discussions with the community. Next slide, please. So here's an infographic just showing kind of where we are. March through June, we figured out we identified and prioritized projects. We did the ballot and the survey process from July 10th to 31st, where we collected input on the comprehensive list of proposed projects prioritized by the community. And then we now are in the action 4, where we're looking at the prioritized projects, figuring out what we can do right now, looking at what can happen in 2020 and things that can advance to project development for 2021. And then again, we cannot emphasize this enough that we're going to keep having community input and doing prioritization throughout the next year or so as things are continuing to change. Next slide, please. Here is the 2020 projects. We're not going to go through each of these one by one, but you can see they're spread out amongst the 4 areas that we did the neighborhood ballots in, and these are just what is happening right now. And if anyone has any questions on this, feel free to ask. There is more details in the implementation plan as well. Next slide. So for next steps, we're going to be continuing to do outreach to the community. We're going to put out some flyers about what we heard from the community, since that was requested, to have some paper, something on paper that we can hand out and translate into different languages. We're going to be meeting with community leaders, community groups, to figure out what the best way to continue this conversation and what will work best for them. We're going to work with them on doing the project implementations for 2020. The home zone programs are going to roll out and start developing projects for 2021. We plan to have quarterly check-ins and implementation progress reports for how this is going for the Reconnect West Seattle overall, and monitoring and evaluation will continue. And we can take any questions if you have, but that's the end of our presentation.
May I ask a question? Can you go back to 2 slides? There you go. The project that is I'm not seeing it. F06. F06. West Marginal Way, implement northbound freight only lane. That would be from Highland Park Avenue North. Yes, is that where it would start?
Yes.
Yes. So I've expressed this concern before. That would reduce West Marginal Way's northbound capacity by close to 50%, not quite, but close. I do understand that Freight has had conversations about this long before the bridge closed. But I just have to say, I think it sends exactly the wrong message to the community when the community is struggling to try and find capacity to keep from having people divert into our neighborhoods. I think reducing the capacity on West Marginal Way northbound it just sends exactly the wrong message, and I think you will get huge pushback on that when it becomes more broadly known. That's it.
Okay. Thanks, Mayor Nichols. I think we know that West Marginal Way is a corridor of great interest, and I think what we're trying to reflect here with this 2020 project list is that in the discussions with Freight, neighborhoods, and bikes, an option to improve freight mobility on West Marginal was highlighted. If the freight only lane is not the way to do that, then we need more discussion with the community. But the materials that you're seeing here and the materials that we are sharing in the implementation plan are an accounting of the survey process. But we obviously will not go do anything if it is not what we should be doing based on task force feedback and in conversations with the partners.
Great, thank you.
So we are coming close to time here, but I don't want to preclude additional questions and conversations for this really important moment. If somebody's not on mute, please mute yourself. But we have a question from Councilmember Herbold, then Jolene Haas, and then we'll go to Deb Barker. Councilmember Herbold.
Sorry, I need to get myself on mute. So the question or comment I have is a comment that I've received specifically from the Highland Park Action Committee, but I think it's feedback that is not specific to this neighborhood because it's not about a specific project. It's more about desires to have a more effective communication, and I think all areas where we're planning these mitigation projects would probably benefit from having some clarity about expectations around communication. And so basically they are asking us, the task force, to help delineate some standards for processes that can be clearly understood more broadly to the community and maintained by the public agencies that like SDOT and Department of Neighborhoods and involve neighborhoods to produce the best results possible for the neighborhood. They really want some sort of a feedback loop and accountability process to be part of the Reconnect West Seattle plan. And just giving, one example that they've provided is they mentioned that a bunch of neighbors on 11th and Webster north of Holden have been putting in monitoring requests directly via the Highland Park Holden project contact email, and they get a blank page as a reply. And so there's not even an understanding of whether or not the requests are getting through to the planners. They've made calls to the project number to find out whether or not the messages are being received. And so that's, I think that's a symptom of what more broadly, I think the request is not just knowing that feedback has been received, but then the accountability piece for knowing that we've heard you, and now we've included your input into the plans. And I don't know how thoroughly we've sort of created that sort of a feedback loop from the survey results to what's in the draft plan. Have we sort of shown our work for the survey results and what the draft plans say? And I think this is going to become more important as we move to that next level of projects. That I agree with former Mayor Nichols that we want to expedite that next level of projects, and that there isn't enough information about yet to make commitments. But I think it's really important that we create this sort of a communication and accountability feedback loop for those conversations as well, in order to be able to move them forward.
Thank you for that comment. I agree, and I'm committed to working with community groups to set up something like that. That'll work for everybody.
Thank you, Councilmember Herbold. We are about 4 minutes beyond time, and I really don't want to take away from this CBA conversation. But Jolene, do you want to share your question very quickly?
Can you hear me?
I can. It's a little echoey, but I can understand you.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I have made mention at least 3 or 4 times about improvements to West Marginal Way, and was told that this group was not addressing anything on West Marginal Way, that it was West Marginal, East Marginal Way, and First Avenue South Bridge, and all that other stuff was being taken out and being decided in some other forum that I never got privy to. And now I see F6 is added there to, have a lane for freight, which I'm not sure if that is a good thing or a bad thing. But if you're going to add things to your little sketch here, why isn't the Duwamish Safe Streets project added so that everybody knows what that's all about? Since you're adding things to West Marginal Way here.
That's a great question. Thanks for bringing that up. And I think this speaks a little bit to what Mayor Nichols and Councilmember Herbold were talking about, which is, here's a snapshot of the things that were in the survey. What about the things that were not in the survey? And so something like the Duwamish Longhouse Crossing, which is a project that was discussed before the West Seattle Bridge was closed, and that is a key project moving forward, but was not part of the survey process. So where's the story there? So it seems like that's a loud and clear feedback we're receiving is, hey, SDOT, thanks for telling us about the survey stuff, but we need the full story. So we can do that.
And I think the bottom line is that we always have this expectation that after the survey, we will go back to communities to prioritize what is coming next, not necessarily assuming coming from SDOT. So I think there is a lot of work to be done, and responding back to community and making sure that the community is prioritizing. Something that is not in here, and that I've been hearing a lot, and this week, so important, the schools are open for lunches, and for the neighborhood to have school lunches. I think there is missing a conversation on how kids can go have and take lunch without, being in danger because of traffic. So there is a conversation that we need to pending as well. I wanted to acknowledge our concern. And so make sure we put it on the notes as well to follow up. And please mute yourself if you're not talking, because there's a lot of help.
Thank you, Paulina. People who have additional questions here, I ask you to please utilize the chat function so we can get back to everybody in writing. And if we have spare time at the end, we can come back and have those questions addressed directly verbally here. But with that, we do need to move on to the next section. I'll turn it over to Heather Marks to move us into that next section.
Okay, maybe we can, yep, keep going. And maybe one more slide. So thank you everyone for your thoughtful comments on the Reconnect West Seattle implementation plan. We are moving quickly and really appreciate your willingness to keep us accountable as we are moving quickly. So first, I just want to, before I introduce Greg Banks, I just want to note a little map that we have here. In June is when we started the community task force to help ensure transparency, and I hope that it's been serving that need for you. In July, due to input from the task force as well as others, we added the immersed tube tunnel option to the cost benefit analysis. In August, we, oops, you know, the little thingies are blocking what it says, but by scoring your priorities for attributes along with the TAP, we've refined the tool. And now you're going to have an opportunity to learn more about the cost benefit analysis and ask questions. By the end of this meeting, you should have a better understanding of how it's going to help us make that repair or replace decision that we expect in October. Next meeting on the 23rd, you'll have another peek behind the curtain and learn more about those results. And then in the fall, we'll have that final CBA report, which will help us, SDOT, make a recommendation to the mayor and will inform the mayor's decision about whether to repair or replace the bridge. Next slide, please. So today we are going to talk about the cost benefit analysis objective and schedule. We're going to discuss attribute weighting, attribute definitions, and measurables. We're going to talk about how we incorporate costs and monetize risks, and then next steps. And I think this is the point where I should turn the reins over to Greg Banks, who is the lead engineer for WSP, our consultants. We're working closely with them each and every day to refine the cost benefit analysis and bring us to a place where we can make a credible recommendation to the mayor. Next slide, please. Greg?
The suspense.
Okay. Yeah, I don't love the suspense. I wonder if Greg Banks maybe is trying to unmute himself. I see that he is here.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
What an entrance.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Greg.
All right. I had the computer and my phone on, so I had to unmute both for some reason. Interesting. All right. So the objective of the CBA shown here is to help us make informed decisions to repair or replace the bridge. And the CBA was formulated when the corridor was closed with the lens of comparing an accelerated replacement on alignment and matching the existing profile versus making further investments into the existing structure if it was determined to be technically feasible. And so the alternatives developed are shown here at the bottom of the screen. We have a temporary shoring alternative, a repair, and then 2 replacements, an accelerated superstructure replacement on alignment, trying to make reuse of existing foundation systems, or a completely new bridge replacement on alignment. That's that number 4. And then added later was the immersed tube tunnel off alignment. And for each alternatives, we're going through and comparing pros and cons as it pertains to the objective of the CBA, which again is to help us make an informed decision to repair or replace the bridge. Next slide. Okay, so as Heather was pointing out, by the end of the presentation, you should have a better understanding of how your feedback has helped shape the cost-benefit analysis and how the CBA process works, and how the CBA will help shape not dictate the repair replace decision. And again, as I mentioned on the objective, it's to help inform that process and then give you an understanding of what the next steps for the CBA are. And from a schedule perspective, as Heather was shown, 23rd, you'll be able to see how we've incorporated the risks and the costs into the cost benefit analysis. And in October, we'll see the preliminary results. Next slide. So based on the CTF feedback, we've advanced several immersed tube tunnel concepts, 3 in total. We have 2 to the north of the existing corridor alignment and 1 to the south of the existing alignment. And one of the 3 immersed tube tunnel concepts will be included as alternative 5 in the cost benefit analysis. And we're currently evaluating whether it's more technically and logistically feasible to put the tunnel to the south or to the north of the existing bridge. And we're taking into consideration traffic modifications, environmental impacts, cost, construction duration, constructability, but also impacts to private properties, you get the Port of Seattle and the railroad as well. Next slide. So this slide shows a couple, the 2 alignments that we're looking at to the north, and plan view up at the top. You got a profile the bottom left and a cross section bottom right. Next slide. And this slide here shows the alignment to the south, which is pushed further to the south than the existing railroad tracks that are there. So here we're asking ourselves a number of questions, where the tunnel components could be cast and how they can be delivered to the site, but also how do the tunnel impacts Harbor Island and the maritime community, and how does the dredging of the Duwamish disrupt the environment and expose hazardous materials or impacts to the tribal fishing rights. Mentioned the private property impacts and how these alignments compare with Sound Transit's off-corridor alignments they're doing for the West Seattle to Ballard link extension and the EIS study that they've done to date. So all different considerations that are going into these alternatives, but I mentioned this came on later. So it's a little bit behind, lagging the bridge alternatives that we're looking at now. So. Okay, so next slide. So moving into the attribute weighting, next slide. So as part of the phase 1 of the CBA process, we identified attributes, which are really the design criteria, which define the value or the benefit, the B in the cost benefit analysis for each of the alternatives. And there are 10 attributes, and we seek input from the city, technical advisory panel, the community task force, and the input received from each of those 3 entities was equally considered in the combined weighting. And looking at the summary of those findings, mobility impacts and seismic safety and constructability had the highest weight factors, and the other attributes were scored similarly. And so looking at the next slide here, those scores are shown here, and the different attributes shown beautifully colored in pink and blue off to the left. But that first column of results, that's the results from the scoring or the weighting from the city. The middle left column with the orange bar at the top, that's from the TAP. Middle right gray bar at the top, the community task force. And then the far right is the combined scores. And again, as indicated by the shaded green rows there, the mobility impacts, seismic safety, and constructability received the highest scores. And then these scores here or weights show the priority of or importance of one attribute relative to another when looking at the different alternatives here. So next slide.
Hey, Greg, I might ask you just to pause real quick for a second. We have two hands up that are new, Marcy Carpenter and then Port Commissioner Steinbrook. Marcy, do you have a question pertaining to where Greg is at right now?
No, you must have missed my hand raised. It was raised in the last session. I'll put it down.
I'm very sorry about that, Marcy. Commissioner Steinbrook?
We're past the discussion item. Thank you. I was going to comment on Mayor Nichols' points.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Mike, and just let me know if hands come up because I'm not seeing them. So, okay. So process. So where were we in the process? The attribute weighting we just went through was phase 1. So that's the column on the left, and we're currently in phase 2. And so you can see the bolded text there in that middle column. And we're working on the scoring of each attribute relative to each of the alternatives. So in phase 1, the weighting that was done, that was comparing each attribute relative to each other independent of the alternatives. In phase 2, we're taking each of those attributes and comparing all alternatives relative to each other. And so that's what we mean by scoring. And we're doing that through the lens of the CBA objective. Again, looking at, are we comparing, are we going to further invest in repairing the bridge or pivot towards a replacement? Phase 2 here, we're also developing rough order of magnitude costs and presenting the results to the TAP for feedback. And then in phase 3, we'll analyze the quantified results, produce a report with pros and cons for each of the alternatives, and then present recommendations relative to repair versus replace, and identify key next steps for future studies and upcoming work. So, next slide. So next slide. So moving into the attribute definition and measurables, discuss there's the 10 attributes, and measurables, that's a term we're using to develop, which are define the attribute definition, and they're developed by various subject matter experts. And so, for example, looking at the top bullet there for environmental engineer would develop the measurable for the environmental impacts, and a seismic engineer would develop the measurables for the seismic safety attribute. And then each attribute has a definition supported by a handful of measurables. And for example, the constructability attribute, a measurable may be schedule impacts, and its unit of measure then would be duration. And for each alternative, the differences in construction duration are identified. Next slide. And so with the attributes and the measurables defined, each alternative is then compared relative to each other. And that's done by assigning one alternative as a baseline. And in the case of Anne, we've identified alternative 2 as the selected baseline. And so that's the repair or the direct rehabilitation. And then the baseline receives a score of 5. And then the other alternatives are compared relative to that baseline using a 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 system. And that meaning that if alternative scores a 7 or 9, it's either preferred or strongly preferred over the baseline. If it receives a 5, it's equal to the baseline. If it receives a 1 or a 3, it's either strong, the baseline is either strongly preferred or preferred over that alternative. So, and we're currently in the process of measuring each attribute relative to the alternatives now. So, next slide. So to further illustrate that process, this is an example. It's a scorecard, so to speak, for constructability attribute. And you can see that in the far left column is the various measurables defined for the attribute, and the the second to the left column is the unit of measure for each of those measurables. And then the remainder of the columns are the various different alternatives. And you could see the quantified or the measured value for each of those measurables there. And those are used to inform the 13579 score. So the bottom row there would be where that score is entered. And you can see for alternative 2, which is the rehabilitation, that's our baseline, it received a score of 5. And then the other alternatives would receive that 1 or a 3 if the alternative is perceived to be less advantageous to the base than the baseline, a 5 if equal to, or a 7 or 9 if it's more advantageous to the baseline, with the lens of what the definition of the attribute is and the measurables included here. So, and again, this is just an example of one of the 10 attributes. They all have their own individual scorecards. And other thing to point out here, alternative 6, you don't see any measurables there. Again, that's because it came on late, but it will be included. So, next slide. So incorporating cost and monetizing risk. Next slide. So we're developing rough order of magnitude cost ranges, in part metrics based, but also in part on actual engineering calculations and calculated quantities. And that's because of the varying level of the alternatives being looked at, the phase 2 or alternative 2 direct rehabilitation. There's been more engineering developed into that. So that's hard quantity-based calculations that support the cost development. But some of the replacement alternatives in part are quantity-based, but also in part based upon metrics from recent relevant experience. Second bullet there's limited estimate. The estimates are limited based upon the assumptions of the cost-benefit analysis. So underlying assumptions is we're remaining on alignment and matching existing profiles. That's except for the tunnel, alternative 6. And it's the high rise only. So we're not looking at the consideration of the approach or the approach cost. And that stems from the lens at which cost benefit analysis was formulated, looking at accelerated replacement versus a further investment in repairing the bridge. Capital costs are reported in 2021 dollars, and they're inclusive of design and construction costs, and also inclusive of contingencies and allowances. Next slide. So first bullet here is Department Redundancy Department. So developed construction costs based upon material quantities, but also supported with metrics from recent relevant experience, and incorporated design and construction contingencies. From a right-of-way or temporary construction easement perspective, we developed some maps of impacted properties and are working with the city to assign values to those impacts. Risk monetization, we've created a risk registry, and we've then identified and monetized risks, not all of them, but those that could be, and assigned a dollar value to it. And those risk values are assigned a rating based upon the probability of the risk actually occurring or materializing, and the severity, what's the impact of that risk. Also inclusive of design and planning costs, so designated them as soft costs or other costs, and that's being estimated as 30% of the overall construction cost. And that's inclusive of cost of engineering, construction administration and inspection, so construction support services, third-party review costs, city costs, et cetera. So where we are now is we're going through the risk registry and identifying, is it a complete list of risks? Is there anything missing? And are we appropriately capturing and monetizing the risks as it pertains to the context of the cost-benefit analysis? Next slide. From a life cycle perspective, we have incorporated construction durations into the estimate, or incorporating them into the estimates, and they're based upon preliminary construction schedules that have been developed and consider when work would occur within the life of each of those alternatives. So the anticipated lifespans being considered, so alternative 2, the repair is 15 to 40 years. As it pertains to the life cycle costs, we're accounting for 40 years. And alternative 5, 4, and 5, the replacements, those are assumed to be 75 plus years, and that's in compliance with both AASHTO and FHWA requirements. And then from a rates perspective, we're looking at a 3% inflation rate and a 2% discount rate, so a net 1%. Also taking into consideration operating and maintenance costs, and using city historical data and scaling those values, and based upon projecting to each of the alternatives. For example, a replacement structure would have a different O&M than the repair of the existing structure. So, and we're currently working with the city through that process. We also are taking into consideration a repair and replacement cost for the replacement alternatives, assuming that at 50 years into the life of that structure, there would need to be some sort of repair done to the structure. Next slide, please.
Hey, Greg, just to quickly interject, Amanda Kirk, you have a question. You raised your hand, but you also put it in the chat. Do you want to summarize and share your question with Greg and the task force?
Yeah, so I have a few different questions, but my more important question is what is the ROM cost for the repair as it stands today for the superstructure repairs, not including the proposed foundation improvements? And then what is the ROM for the foundation improvements alone? And then the last one with ROM, what is the approximate ROM for the cheapest of the span replacement scenarios that are being considered?
So we're in the process of developing those costs now, and so it's a work in progress. And so, especially making sure that the city's had a chance to go through and look at numbers and everything, and we got the appropriate contingencies and whatnot accounted for. So, so I would say that those are work in progress at this point in time.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Are you ready, Michael?
Yeah, thank you, Greg.
Okay. Yeah. You want to go to the next slide? So regarding
Greg, I'm sorry. Before you start, I just want to give a shout out to poor Michael. It's hard to monitor both the chat and the hand raising. So, Michael, maybe you didn't see it. There are several people with hands raised. So before Greg goes on, maybe we can address those.
I just see Jolene's hand that's been up for a long time, and Deb, and I apologize. I assume that those were just continued from previous asking questions and not lowered. Are there other questions or hands raised?
I think Katie had a point to make as well.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks. Katie Garrow, Deputy Director at MLK Labor. I basically was just talking about, labor. I want to say about 4 meetings ago, I had brought up a request that we add an 11th criteria area to measure workforce impacts. And I've since been in conversation with Bill from SDOT, who's been really great to connect me with Greg Izzo to understand what exactly that would look like, what they would measure. And it sounds like they have some quantifiables that they can measure that would demonstrate workforce impacts of each each scenario. And so we're definitely still interested in having that 11th criteria area added. As it stands, we've been told that it's just going to be presented in a report to the mayor, and we want it to be a part of the full conversation when we're talking about all the other CBA criteria. So that's still our request. I'm not sure what the issue is with adding it as an 11th criteria area if we are able to quantify it. So just curious about whether anybody has a response as to why that doesn't seem to be possible.
So, Katie, thank you so much. This is Heather. Sorry, let me put on my camera. This is Heather. I know that we've had, that you and Bill have had those conversations, and I think, you know, and I shared in the chat sort of our approach to this. Bill, maybe you want to share some of those measurables, because that hasn't been part of the internal conversation.
Yeah, so what Katie asked for more specifically in terms of the information was about economic impacts of continued closure versus repair sooner, as well as different labor hour impacts for the different scenarios. And Greg is looking at what's achievable with this. There are some challenges to just figuring out the economics of bridge closure, apart from other larger factors like COVID. But he is talking with WSP about what can be assessed and provided within a report, not necessarily, and probably not as an attribute, but at least within the report overall.
Thank you, Bill. John, just since your comment is related and have perhaps an additional point, John Persack, do you want to share your comment and question, and then we'll go to David Beestock?
Sure, that'd be great. And yes, I'd like to echo Katie's concerns that that's an important attribute. And the reason I bring it up is because I'm looking at the various alternatives for where a tunnel would go, for example, and some of them place them directly underneath the gate operations for Terminal 18 and Terminal 5. And that is a direct jobs impact, not just for Seattle, but for the region. And I'm actually going to post a link in the chat here, that an article that came out in the News Tribune that discusses how when we lose cargo, it doesn't go to Tacoma, doesn't go to LA, it all goes to Canada. And Canada is making a lot of investments in their infrastructure because that country is more able to do so at this time. So I think baking in what the impact for each scenario will be in terms of the potential loss of jobs, both short-term and long-term, in addition to how jobs would be created, would be an important piece in franchising, you know, as a stakeholder for labor and other stakeholders for the maritime industry in general, so that you know, we have a good long-term understanding of what the economic impacts will be, as well as the regional impact. So I think it would be very important to have that 11th criterion in there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. David Beestock?
Yeah, thanks everybody. A question for Greg and the cost benefit team. There was a note that it was looking at high rise only as an assumption. And I'm wondering sort of why that is, and the approaches aren't factored in, and how that relates specifically to tunnel options, and if it's sort of like for like with whatever the opposite of high rise is for a tunnel, or if the approaches are being factored in on that.
Yeah, this is Greg, WSP. So the underlying assumption with the cost benefit analysis is correct. It's high rise only. And the origins of the cost benefit analysis is when the corridor was closed, there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether this bridge was even technically feasible to rehabilitate it. We hadn't gone through and done the condition testing. We didn't have the instrumentation in place. Now that we have both of those in place, we're feeling more confident that you can technically rehabilitate this bridge. But in that lens, it was, if we have to pivot directly to a replacement because it's not technically feasible, then you would be looking at just what's wrong, and that's the high-rise portion of the bridge. And so that was the lens which that was developed, that underlying assumption, for making comparison to a a tunnel alternative, which does have significant more approach work to it, you would need to take that into consideration when making that comparison and whether or not you have a cost associated with the approaches to make that comparison, or whether you just look at, say, the Immersed 2 tunnel portion and not all the approach work. For that comparison, it's probably more appropriate to make it an allowance for the elevated bridge approach work to make the comparison, because it's significant impacts with the tunnel. So it's not a one-to-one relationship, so to speak. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I guess in terms of the origins, but I guess also I'm just curious, factoring out that approach doesn't really give a true cost of what we're talking about. And I'm still not sure. I guess I'd be curious so that's on the overarching thing, both high rise and the tunnel option. And then I guess I'm curious who determines how that's factored in. It sounds like you don't have a clear answer on the approach. Who would determine what is the closest to a one-to-one comparison?
Yeah, there's so one of the risk items, which we're going to get into risk here, is just the risk because we have the assumption in the CBA that we're going to match profile as well. And with the Coast Guard desiring a higher vertical clearance envelope over the Duwamish, meaning you have to raise the profile, then what's the risk associated with that? And the risk being you have to have more length added to the project. You can't just tie back in right within the high rise, which means that you have approach work that needs to be done as well. So there's a cost associated with that. So there is a cost allowance that accounts for what you're asking about that could be applied to the high rise to make that more one-to-one comparison with the tunnel alternative. So it's there.
Greg,
I guess is what I'm saying. You just have to do a little bit of math. So
to continue along David's questions, and do you want to? Do you feel like that answers your question? You say, I share your question about approaches. Why are they excluded for superstructure replacement? Aren't they a necessary cost of this? And do you feel like your question is answered? Do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I would just want to make sure that those costs are included. If they're part of the replacement, then they should be there. And it looked from the slide as if they were specifically excluded. So I think that David and I both had the same thought there.
Yep. No, and I guess my answer would echo what I just said, that in terms of the lens of the cost benefit analysis and the assumptions that have been made, part of this is the risk registry as well, which we're going to walk into. One of those risks being the Coast Guard and desiring higher clearance envelopes over the Duwamish, which the repercussion of that is having to replace the approaches. And so there's a monetized value to that risk, which will be inclusive here. So you can do that extrapolation to make that comparison. So.
Thanks, Greg. I'm going to track the questions that are in place, but I'm going to ask Greg to keep moving through the presentation so we don't fully lose the momentum of where we're at. And then there is a lot of room for questions and answers at the end.
Okay. All right. So moving into risk management. So as I mentioned, we have a risk registry. It just so happens the example that I'm showing here is the one we just talked about. But in terms of what talking about, the risk it's a multiple step process, and it's continual. It's a living document. But we have a series of slides here to show you what that looks like, and we're going to focus on one of the identified risks. In the case at hand, it's the Coast Guard requiring that additional vertical clearance if a replacement bridge is selected as the path forward. And remember that the baseline assumption was that the replacement bridge was on alignment and matched the existing profile of the corridor. So next slide. So after you identify the risk, the next step is to qualitatively assign a risk analysis on a very high, medium, low, very low process. And so this considers the probability of that risk occurring or materializing. That's at column C. And also considers the impact of that risk, again, at the very high, high, medium, low, very low basis. And then the product of those giving you an overall risk rating. Is it, in this case, the red shade there means it's a high risk. So next slide. So the next step in the process is to develop a risk response. And are you going to avoid the risk? So it changes the project plan to eliminate the risk by adjusting the scope, schedule, and or budget. Are you transferring it so it shifts but it doesn't eliminate the risk, the risk and responsibility? Are you mitigating it, reducing the probability and or effect of the risk to an acceptable level? Or are you accepting the risk? It's a do nothing strategy until the risk materializes and then addressing it. So the risk response, in this case at hand, we're saying transferring it. So it's a consideration to be had beyond the cost benefit analysis. So it'll be looked at in further studies. Next slide. So then we identify the risk status and how are we monitoring and controlling it. And so this risk item, again, as I mentioned, we're transferring that risk, but it's going to have it's going to be inclusive of a significant cost consideration within the cost benefit analysis, where we end our study, but future studies will look into that and potentially can eliminate that risk or reduce the cost of the risk or account for it in the cost. So next slide.
Can I, I'm sorry, can I just, I'm a little bit hung up on this labor question. I do want to note that FTEs associated with construction jobs are included in the analysis, and we aren't assuming any big change in economic access with replacement versus repair. So I appreciate the desire, and we can certainly add a full analysis. Maybe analysis isn't the right word. A full discussion of the impact that that more time associated with a repair or replacement would have. But at this stage of the game, which is late, we're not going to add this as another attribute. So that's where we are on that one. Sorry, Greg.
No worries, Heather. Okay. And then the last step, oh, sorry, next slide, Michael. The last step here in the risk registry includes a process for monetizing the risk, if applicable. Not all risks can be monetized. An example, we're monetizing the risk by accounting for the additional project extents going out into the approaches, as was previously discussed. In the case at hand here, though, need to account for that could have a different impact, whether or not, say, sound transit's included on the corridor or not. So looking at those differences too, and what I mean by that, there's grade restrictions. And so the risk received a high risk factor, and so we assigned a 70% probability factor of that risk occurring. And we have an absolute calculated cost impact for that additional length. And there's a value shown in here, but again, this is a living, breathing document that's will be getting updated continuously. So, and then there's also a column here for which alternatives the risk is applicable to, and in the case at hand, the risk is applicable to the replacement alternatives only, which is that Alt 4 and 5 column L there. So, next slide. And so this just shows a more macro view of the risk registry. We have a number of different risks identified, some of which are being monetized. It's important to note again, that this is a living document which gets revisited regularly and updated. And so I think currently we have 36 different items included in the risk registry. So next slide. So this slide shows in a different form a summary of the risk identified to be monetized, listed over there on the left. And there's separate bar charts for each alternative. You can see alternative 1, 2, 3, 4 there. And then there's two different colored bars, the red bar and the gray bar. And the red bar represents risk associated with the initial capital investment of that alternative, with the gray bar representing the risk associated with the life cycle cost of that alternative. So the bolded portions represent the factored monetized risk recognized. So that's a risk value with the probability assigned to it, whereas the lighter colored portion of the bars represents the total or absolute risk, so no probability assigned to it. And so, which that probability again accounts for the likelihood that risk would occur and the impact of that risk materializing. So that's that qualitative assessment, which we showed on a few slides back. So, next slide. So next steps, we've developed the weighting for each of the alternatives relative to each other. That was phase 1. We're developing the performance scores, and so that's looking at the alternatives relative to each other for each attribute. Phase 2, and assigning the 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 rankings to each. We're including alternative 6, the immersed tube tunnel. We're also reviewing the cost developments and developing the cost or order of magnitude costs, inclusive of operating and maintenance, risk monetization, as we discussed, but also the right-of-way cost calculation. So we've developed some exhibits of impacted properties, and whether that be from a temporary construction easement perspective for the on-alignment alternatives, but with the immersed tube tunnel being off-alignment, permanent acquisitions. Then we're going to go through and review the initial findings, and then do a final review, and then do our report with recommendations, which will bleed into the fall, and the schedule that Heather was showing earlier, with the decision of the repair or making further investments in repairing the structure or pivoting towards a replacement. Next slide. With that, questions.
So Pauline and I, with Michael's help, will be attempting to give everyone a chance, A, to ask their questions, but 2, also this is a conversation for the task force. So we're going to try and make sure that everyone gets a chance to participate. Who wants to lead off with a question or comment?
We have hands raised from Dan and Amanda Kirk.
Okay.
And perhaps we'll start there.
Yep.
And then I can help work through the chat and other hands as well.
Great. Dan.
Okay, so thank you. The first question I have, I'll just go with the only question I have. Will we have the information to really put together a thorough cost-benefit analysis if we don't have the thermal expansion data going into winter for the cycle that we need to see how the bridge reacts and the pier bearing being released? Are we going to be able to put numbers together if we haven't got those repairs in place first to see how feasible and the cost of a repair would be to this bridge?
So this is Greg, WSP. Can I field that? Yeah. So it's a good question, Dan. And the answer is that the cost benefit analysis has been informed based upon the condition assessments that have been done to date, the instrumentation that's on the bridge, using that to correlate our analytical models, and looking at a next phase of rehabilitation. The work being done now is stabilization. It's not necessarily being conducted to put the bridge back in service, but another phase would be required to do so. At the conclusion of the CBA, it'll be based upon the analytics that have been done to date, but there will be a contingency on there, and in that it's also contingent upon how the bridge reacts to the stabilization measures that are being conducted now. So yes, I think that final determination is going to be contingent on that.
I guess a quick follow-up on that. Just so if I understand right, we don't know what the repair would be at this point because we don't know how the shoring's reacting or how it's going to react to the shoring efforts. So can we put a legitimately decent estimate together with just not having all that information yet?
Yeah, I think with the analytics that have been done to date, I mean, there was analytics that went into the stabilization measures that are being constructed. We have the instrumentation in place on the bridge, and so we are seeing how the bridge is behaving to that work. For example, when they hoisted the panels, we looked at that data real time. We had predicted how the bridge would move when they were doing that work, and it correlated well. The bridge lives and breathes, as I call it, relative to environmental conditions, mainly thermal effects and also solar radiation. And so we've been able to correlate how the bridge is moving to our analytical models as well. And based upon dialing them in, our analytical models, then looking at what's needed to restore service on this bridge and doing those analytics, we have an idea of what that would be. And so now, again, we're going to continue to watch the bridge as the remainder of the stabilization measures are constructed. We'll watch it real time and compare it to how we predicted the bridge will behave relative to how it actually behaves. And that's going to inform the ultimate decision here.
With that, and that's my last question. With that, can you predict on the analytics and with the data you have how it'll react to freezing temperatures and the thermal conditions that we haven't had monitoring equipment on yet, the bridge during those seasons? Will you guys be able to determine that it's a viable fix and that it's going to last a decent period of time?
Yeah, we've taken thermal data from the University of Washington that's been published for years. And we've taken the limited amount of instrumentation data, correlated it to the measured temperatures and solar radiation, and projected it back so we could look at the seasonal effects. And so yeah, that's being accounted for.
Thank you for your time.
Amanda, to be followed by Deb and then Jill.
Quick question. Where does the seismic deficiency of this bridge fit within the city's overall assessment of seismic variabilities throughout, or vulnerabilities throughout the transportation infrastructure that the city oversees? This may be a SDOT question.
Heather, do you want me to take a shot at that one, or?
Hey folks, this is Matt Donahue. I can take a shot at that if you'd like. From a seismic vulnerability standpoint versus the rest of the city's inventory, this is one of the least risky bridges from a seismic vulnerability standpoint because it was the newest bridge that was built and designed. So compared to much older bridges in the 100+ year vintage like Fremont and Ballard Bridge, University Bridge, this bridge was designed at a time when we had a much higher consideration for seismic forces.
Okay.
Thank you.
Deb, to be followed by Jill and then Jolene.
Thank you, Greg B. And I appreciate all this work. I apologize in advance because the majority of it is way over my head. So 2 questions that I can get out. Is there any sort of CBA 101 that can be provided to those of us who have never had CBA in our professional lives or our personal lives? So that's one question. Or tutoring or anything like that, so we can ask the stupid questions without 100 people watching or listening in. Number two is you said that there's 36 items in the risk registry. And is there any way to have that available just to look at so I can fixate on it or understand it? It seems that there's a huge amount of really valuable information, big picture, little picture, many, many weeds within that risk register. And I was curious if that register is available just to look at. Thank you.
Greg, do you have a response to that?
Well, I guess that's we have it available at that risk registry. Again, it's a living, breathing document. I guess, Heather, I would leave it up to you in terms of how we share information or when information gets shared because of that, the nature of the document. So.
Okay. Jill, to be followed by Jolene, and then Commissioner Steinbrook.
Right. So would you like me to respond to that question?
No, sure. You bet.
Okay. So first of all, I want to level set a little bit here. The cost benefit analysis at this point is a really technical document. And so we can provide to you the attributes and the measures at a certain point, though the document becomes deliberative. And so providing it to the task force before we make a recommendation makes it a public document. And we really need to keep that deliberative status until the mayor's had a chance to go through it. At that point, we can completely let that go. But we are and the mayor will be present to talk with you about her decision when that time comes. We can provide you with the attributes and the measurables it could be that you guys already have that information. I'm not 100% sure. That we can provide you with, but there is a deliberative process that we need to be engaged in, and we're opening the door as far as we can without risking that and creating a situation that no elected official wants to be in.
Jill, to be followed by Jolene, and then Commissioner Steinbrook.
Right. So I see Heather has answered my question primarily in the chat, which is having to do whether I saw that the decisions noted on the last slide were repair or replace, and I was just wondering whether the repair and replace was continued to be an option. So that appears to be answered in the chat.
Okay. Any more edification on that, Heather?
I don't think so. The decision here is, are we going to repair and then replace, or are we just going to pivot directly to replacement without that interim step? Thanks, Jill.
All right, Jolene, to be followed by Commissioner Steinbrook, and then I think John is the next person I saw.
Okay, I think I'm up here. Yeah, just had a question regarding
Jolene.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Jolene, you had your hand up in the thing. All right, we'll get back to Jolene then. Commissioner Steinbrook.
Well, just two things. It would seem that a repair in the shorter term that would be maybe seen as an interim with a longer term replacement option might be of value to look at, particularly if we're looking at very significant seismic costs to extend the life of the existing bridge to 40 years or more, which was reported in the papers. I find that kind of intriguing, in fact. But the other question I have was regarding the Immersed tunnel. It's hard not to believe that there aren't fatal flaws in that whole concept. I know that there's a lot of excitement around it. It's not exactly a very common technology, and it has a lot of basic problems with regard to this this area, and I'd like to hear what from the technical experts, what they see as some of the greatest challenges. I would identify the clearances necessary, dredging of contaminated soils, and would like to hear what some of the other significant challenges are seen with that alternative.
So, Commissioner Steinbrook, let me just set it up by saying that, you know, a fatal flaw has sort of a specific meaning in this circumstance. So there isn't anything that would prevent us from doing an immersed tube tunnel. There are, however, a number of challenges to an immersed tube tunnel that either Greg Banks or Matt Donahue can speak to. Greg, can you take a little bit of that?
Yeah, I think there's a number of challenges you touched on some, but then also just getting the segments where you're casting them, how you're delivering them to the site, and how you're setting them. I mean, that's all a number of difficulties. Consideration then also of all of the utilities that are running through this area, and how are you going to make those connections? What are you doing with the utilities? There was some discussion earlier, just the access to and from the port. You're cutting off a lot of surface street access, and how are you making those connections, and how are you going to do all that work and not have a significant impact to the port? Looking at then you also have the railroad. You got the tracks running parallel to the corridor here, and how are you going to pass under those tracks, or are you realigning the tracks? There's the number of complexities to deal with here. So,
okay, all right, thanks,
John. And John's the last person who I've seen either on the hand raised or the chat who's asked to be recognized. So anyone else who wants to either express your concerns or ask a question, please use either the chat or the hand raise. Thank you. John.
Yeah, thanks. I didn't want to take up any more time. So Heather and I have been discussing the contract with WSP just so I can get a better understanding of you know, what the scope of work is, just to kind of add on to remarks. So that's pretty much all I got. So appreciate the time anyway, though.
Sure. Unless I'm wrong, John, and I don't think I am, the contract with WSP is a public document, so we can send that to you.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right. We've got plenty of time. Anne, you had a question?
It's a question about the CBA, but it's also sort of a funny question. I was thinking about the stabilization and wondering, how do you test it once it's done? Do you run a bunch of buses over it, or what do you do to make sure that it's actually working and that it can actually hold the weight that you think it's going to hold? And then the connected question is, will that be ready before we see the CBA, or is that stabilization work going to overlap with the presentation of the CBA?
The answer to that two-part question, take the second part. The answer is it's going to overlap. We'll be through the CBA process ahead of the stabilization work being completed. That's the earlier discussion. That's the contingency that the findings of the CBA will be contingent upon that stabilization work being conducted. In terms of how you understand if the stabilization work is working as intended, the bridge is seeing loads on a daily basis just due to environmental conditions, the thermal variations, and so it's moving, and we can correlate those movements to our analytical modeling. But load testing is a possibility. I mentioned hoisting the work platforms onto the bridge as a load of a known weight and location, so that we can calculate its impacts or how the bridge reacts to those loads. You could do that in a similar manner. The stabilization work, though, is not intended to put the bridge back in service. A second phase of work would need to be done to do that. So, and I guess to add on to that, while the work is being constructed, we're correlating theoretical, analytically predicted behavior versus the actual measured behavior from the instrumentation as well. So we'll get that real time.
Representative Cody, Eileen Cody, and then Chris Davis. Representative Cody.
Yeah, you can hear me. I'm sorry. I was just wondering on this replacement issues, if the sound transit option was being included on all of the replacement analysis. And then you specifically talked about the Coast Guard requiring the permit to be, the bridge would, or the whatever structure would have to be higher. And then you included the sound transit discussion in that, and I didn't understand how the higher bridge fits with sound transit.
So let me start, Representative Cody, and it's good to have you here. The first is that the Coast Guard can require us to have a higher profile. It's not required that they do so. But that is something that we have to consider a risk, because they could require it of us. Whether or not the sound transit facility goes on this bridge or a different one would be more a question of the type, size, and location effort that we'll have to do once we have chosen the repair or pivot directly to replacement. So, so the type, size, and location study, I know that word makes people a little crazy, is what kind of bridge, how big, and where, right? And so the how big and what kind of bridge are the questions that encompass whether or not sound transit could be accommodated on this bridge. The question of sound transit being included on this bridge or continuing with their separate structure is a conversation that we're engaged in with sound transit. And it's not primarily an engineering question. We can build a bridge, you just ask Greg. We can build anything you want. It's more of a policy question. And so we're engaged with sound transit on that deeply. Was that all of them?
Yeah, I get it. That's why I'm just glad to hear you are engaged with sound transit, since they have some money to bring to the table.
Yeah. And that's part of the policy question, when they would have money available.
All right, Chris Davis, and then I see Deb and Dan again. So we'll call on them. If there's anyone else who hasn't spoken, please let us know so that we can get you heard. Chris Davis. Okay, we'll come back to Chris. Deb Barker.
Hi, thank you. I am looking at the Immersed, the ITT north and south concepts, north and south of the bridge, and I just had a question about why there's actually are there supposed to be two tubes, one to fit under the Duwamish River and one to fit under the Duwamish waterway? Or how is the ITT dealing with the waterway? And that would be on the eastern side of Harbor Island.
Yeah, this is Greg. So on the eastern side, so there's the west channel and the east channel. The east channel, you would be elevated by the time you get there. And so the profiles included on those slides, we have this green shaded area, which we call retained fill. That's you'd have to get elevated to a certain amount before you cross over the east channel.
So the open cut then is coming into, the areas of open cut are then coming into another bridge. So there'd be ITT plus bridge for this potential solution, correct?
Yeah, there's actually a lot. There's the ITT You got a cut and cover section, you have an open cut with walls, then the embankment, then to a bridge. Yep.
Yeah, you have retained fill. Lastly, question on this, when you have open cut or retained fill, can you, because that's right of way, can you do anything in those areas, build affordable housing? I don't know, something like that?
Affordable housing on Harbor Island?
No, I'm looking at the open cuts or the retained fill areas, the cut and cover areas. What's to become of those areas should we have an ITT concept?
Well, I mean, I think that is probably a land use question that we would consider once we decide that that's the concept we want to go forward with.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you.
Dan?
I think Heather answered it, but for those who can't see the chat box, I was just questioning if the Coast Guard could stop the repair of the bridge because of the higher, requiring higher structure.
No.
If that could be an issue, but hopefully an existing permit wouldn't allow that.
Right.
So that was that for whoever couldn't read that in chat. That was the question.
Okay. Anyone else?
Did we talk about the ITT concept and the environmental analysis for the river? And what would be the impact on the river for this? I don't think we went into any conversations around that. This is Paulina.
Yes.
Yeah, the answer to that, Paulina, is that the environmental impacts is an attribute, and it has considerably higher impacts than the bridge alternatives that we're talking about here. So it also just impacts on the navigation channel as well. So.
Thank you, Greg. But did you mean it was done, or it will be?
It's being done. So.
It's being done.
It's being done with the lens of what the cost-benefit analysis is, which is making that informed decision of repair versus replace here. And so there's a number of measurables identified for the environmental attribute, and so it's looked at from that lens. So not the environmental process necessarily being started, right? So.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And Greg and Megan controlling the slides, perhaps it would be helpful to go back quite a few, not to make you click too many times, but so people can see what the ranks and weightings are, just as we're talking about environment and how that contextually fits into the overall picture, I think is helpful to further ground Paulina's question.
It gets forward in the slide deck.
Nope.
Yeah.
Nope. Were you looking for the weightings?
Yes, the weighting.
That colorful slide, Meg.
This is the next one. There you go.
Yeah.
Nope.
So environment.
Yes.
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah, so environmental's the third attribute down there from the top, and you could see the different entities, the city, the TAP, the CTF, in terms of how they weighted that relative to the other attributes. At the combined basis, it receives 8.5% of the total 100% score. So, but in terms of the attribute itself, it's defined as a measure of the potential adverse effect to the built or natural environment. So making consideration of noise and vibration impacts within the waterway, 4F resources, emissions, wildlife impacts. Those are the measures that are being used to define the environmental attribute.
Commissioner Steinbrook, I know that you have to sign off soon, and I just want to make sure your hand is raised, and I just want to make sure we're not leaving a question hanging for you before you.
Thanks. I just had one technical question related again to the Immersed tunnel. Your diagram shows a 46 or 47 foot depth of navigable water. And I think that we need more than that. I think it's closer to 56 or 57 feet, which would push the tunnel that much deeper. So I'm just curious where you arrived at that 46 foot figure.
Yeah, it's a function of what the dredge depth would be and having a clearance above that for the channel itself, and then beyond there, it's the grades and understanding how to get in and out of the channel there. When you said the 56 feet, I'd be curious to compare notes on where you got that.
That's why we're doing our dredging now with T5, and that is the number that I have been told from the port that we need if there's to be alterations here, and the 46 foot depth would not be feasible. But we can follow up with staff on that.
Yeah, if you could follow up on that, that'd be great.
Sure.
Like I say, we've been coordinating with the city for that number we have. So. Yeah.
Okay, Greg, thank you. And I have to sign off. I apologize. I've got some other pressing matters to get to. Thank you all. It's been a very good, engaging discussion and presentation. Thank you all.
Councilmember Herbold.
Just wanted to flag on the phase 3 on slide 30, it references this fall, and I'm just wanting to make sure that that is still early October. I'm just asking because the version of this chart that was presented on the August 5th meeting specifically said October for phase 3.
We are planning for October.
Oh, I see you included that in the chat. Thank you so much, Heather.
Sam Zimbabwe. I see
So
it.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to jump in a little bit because I know we're going on 2 hours. We got a little bit of time left, but I've been here listening the whole time and really appreciate everybody's questions, comments, feedback. You know, Deb, you said earlier it's hard to ask a question that you feel like might be a stupid question in front of 100 people. I think there is no such thing as a stupid question in this context, and it's really important for us to hear what's going through the task force's mind. This is a ton of really complex technical information, and we can get wrapped up in that technical aspect if we don't get good questions that sort of push us to make sure we can explain it to everybody. So I really appreciate the discussion that's been here. I also just want to make sure people are clear on a couple of things. One is that if the decision that's really before us is repair versus replacement now, and we're not, the CBA and this process won't determine what replacement looks like if we are on that replacement path. So we are not deciding today whether, or this fall, whether we are building a tunnel or building a replacement bridge. We are deciding, are we immediately going into replacement, or are we working on repair into replace? And then the other big piece of this is that this cost benefit analysis is part of the decision-making process. It's not a big machine that spits out an answer and we go and do immediately what the machine tells us to do. And things like the risk register and understanding what some of the sensitivities and challenges are part of our explanation of the decision-making process that we will owe to everybody this fall, and the reason why we are recommending a certain direction on the bridge. So I think keep those questions coming. I think we've got time at the next TAP meeting also to talk a little bit more about this, and if you have thoughts about what would be most helpful information for that, please share it with Bill, Diane, with Mayor Nichols, with Paulina, whoever you feel comfortable sharing that information with. We want to make sure the next session is also very valuable in terms of this information.
And Deb, let me just assure you that asking a dumb question is a totally survivable event. having done it a few times myself. Councilmember Herbold.
In the spirit of asking them questions, just interested to know why the weighting numbers are only odd numbers.
This is Greg, WSP. It's a relative comparison to a baseline, with the baseline being 5. You could pick whatever numbers you want. If you wanted to go 1 through 10, it's a level of granularity, so to speak, crudeness or refinedness. And so we found that in doing this study on other projects, when you include more numbers, it gets more confusing. So we boiled it down to the 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 process. But if you like even numbers, we could use 2 numbers.
There you go. All right. Anybody else, particularly folks who have not yet had a chance to ask or express themselves? I know we've thrown a lot of information at you today. It's going to take some time for all of us to absorb that and come back at the next meeting for the next level of conversation about this. But I want to thank everyone for being very present here today and asking good questions and giving good initial response to what we've heard. And Greg, thank you for your presentation and joining us here today. Michael or Paulina, anything for the good of the order? Or are we going to let folks actually out of here a few minutes early? I thought there was a rule.
I was wondering if, even, I know like we are on a different subject, but if is there anything on the agenda that needed to be responded, like on the Reconnect with Seattle, because we were so short allowing questions and answers. This will be a good time, maybe allow 5 more minutes to do that, and if not, then we can adjourn. I just want to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak up.
Good. If there was anything earlier on the agenda that
we have a question from Yasmin. Yasmin, do you want to ask your question directly?
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, Heather, if you could just talk a tiny bit more about how there will be a discussion as part of the CBA around labor and economic impacts. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. The first thing I want to note is that the jobs that are created by the construction are included in the cost benefit analysis. The element of whether or not repair or replace has a broader economic impact is something that is very difficult to quantify, and it's especially difficult to quantify in the extremely compressed cost benefit analysis timeframe that we have here. I think one thing that we can all agree on is that making a decision about whether we're pivoting to replacement or whether we're going to do an interim repair, having that decision made quickly is really what's going to create the certainty around those economic aspects. So there will be qualitatively, so in writing, what we expect the economic impacts to be. And I'd also like to say that a project of this size has some really incredible and unique ways, presents us with some unique opportunities to exercise the full range of labor happiness in terms of apprenticeships, in terms of, making sure we're paying that appropriate wage. There are lots of opportunities for us here. And so we'll have that full discussion in the recommendation to the mayor. I do want to note that while all of those economic impacts are important, this is primarily an engineering exercise. So the decision is much broader than engineering, but the cost benefit analysis is really primarily an engineering exercise. And so, and we also want to come to the end of this cost benefit analysis process so that we can fold all that information into a recommendation for the mayor. I don't think it's in question that the mayor is supportive of labor and always has been. And so I'm sure that you will be able to see in the decision that she finally renders and in our supporting materials a ways to lift up labor. Does that help?
Great, thank you. Anybody else? Seeing none, thank you all again for your time today. I hope the 3 weeks off re-energized you and you're ready to go into the fall, and particularly October, for some additional very important conversations, information sharing, and recommendations. We're in the 25th week since the closure of the West Seattle Bridge. We're getting really close to half a year. So people in the communities that are affected are very anxious to make sure that we stay on time and make good decisions and recommendations on their behalf. So thank you all very much for your time and effort on this. With that, Paulina?
Seems like a good also to do is, if you're interested in being part of the subgroup for the lower bridge, to please send your name in the reflection form. And we were looking for representation from businesses and different stakeholders. So please do let us know, the sooner the better, so we can get that going specifically on the lower bridge. Any other to-do list, I think, for, well, the reflection form, I always appreciate receiving those and giving us feedback or recommendations. If you think something that we didn't cover or we should reaffirm in the next meeting, which will be, Michael?
23rd.
The 23rd. That's
Indeed,
correct.
the 23rd.
Yes.
We have a request for West Marginal Way to be there, so we'll talk about that. Pauline and I will be talking in the offsetting week with SDOT, and we'll see if we're ready to do that and if there's room on the agenda. So thank you all again.
Thanks, everybody. A full 16 minutes back.
Be well.
Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Take care, everyone.